Have you ever had that moment where you're like, oh my gosh, I'm trying to figure out this whole money thing. Like, I'm reading articles, maybe even trying to tackle some of those, classic finance books, but it
Yeah.
still feels like there's this like basic understanding that I'm missing.
Yeah, that feeling of being overwhelmed is super common. And it's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today.
You guys shared some really interesting stuff about navigating the world of personal finance.
And we're going to unpack some of the core ideas from those.
We're going to focus specifically on Rich Dad, Poor Dad
Ah, yes, the classic Robert Kiyosaki.
by Robert Kiyosaki.
Yeah.
This book has had a huge impact on a lot of people, and I think it's because, it challenges those conventional ideas about money and wealth.
Totally. And what makes it even more interesting is how Kiyosaki's own story is like woven into these lessons.
Right.
It's all based on his experiences with these two father figures.
Yeah. So you've got his biological father, the poor dad, right? This highly educated guy, a teacher, believed in that, traditional path, get a secure job, work hard, all of that.
Right. The classic American dream, sort of.
Right. But then you've got his friend Mike's dad, who he calls the rich dad, who was a successful entrepreneur and had this like totally different way of thinking about money.
Yeah, he had a different set of rules almost.
Totally different rules. And it's that contrast that really forms the foundation of this whole book.
Yeah. It's super interesting to see how those two perspectives play out.
So what we want to do today in this deep dive is really pull out the most impactful lessons from this book.
Exactly. We want to help you understand those key principles. Like, what's the difference between an asset and a liability?
Right. That seems to be like a big one.
Huge. How do you make your cash flow work for you?
Right.
And maybe most importantly, what kind of mindset shifts do you need to make to have more clarity around your finances?
And potentially maybe even more independence.
Totally.
So I want to jump into one of the first stories Kiyosaki tells in the book about his entrepreneurial endeavors, or at least attempts, which is this story about him and Mike, his friend, trying to make their own money.
Yeah, the lead nickel.
The lead nickels.
Oh.
So as kids, they're like, oh, we want to be rich, so let's just make our own money. It's kind of funny and cute, but it really sets the stage for, their drive and wanting to understand how money works.
Totally. And what I find so interesting is how their dads react to this little scheme.
So differently.
Yeah.
Right. So you have Robert's dad, the poor dad, and he sees it and he's like, well, this is not right. You can't just make your own money. It's unethical. And by the way, you guys failed. He didn't actually make real money. But Mike's dad, the rich dad, is like, wait a minute, I see something here. I see the drive. I see the partnership.
Yeah, he's like, you guys are trying to create something. I like that.
Yeah. And I think that's such a key takeaway because it shows that being good with money isn't just about being, book smart or having the best intentions.
It's a whole different skill set.
It is. And it can be learned and developed. Even Robert's poor dad recognized his own limitations and said, hey, if you want to learn how to be rich, go talk to Mike's dad.
Right. He knew he wasn't the right person to teach those lessons.
And that brings us to one of the first major lessons that Kiyosaki lays out in the book.
Which is?
This idea of working for money versus having money work for you.
Oh, yeah.
And he illustrates this through his experience and Mike's experience working for Mike's dad.
At his store. Right.
Yeah. But here's the kicker. They're making 10 cents an hour.
10 cents. Like, how can you live on that?
Right. And it's almost like, oh man, he's really exploiting these kids. But the whole point is that it wasn't about the 30 cents they each earned on those Saturdays.
Yeah, there was a much bigger lesson there.
There was. And Robert was ready to quit. He's like, this is ridiculous. Why am I even doing this? And that's when Mike's dad steps in. And he's like, look, it's not about the paycheck. It's about what's going on up here. And he points to his head. He's talking about this stuff between your ears, which is your financial intelligence.
So he's saying that real wealth isn't about how much you earn. It's about how you think about money.
Exactly.
Interesting.
It's not about luck. It's not about just, working hard at a job. It's about understanding how money works and making it work for you.
So financial intelligence is the real key differentiator.
It is. And Kiyosaki talks a lot about how fear keeps people trapped in this cycle of working for money. The fear of not paying bills, the fear of losing their job, the fear of not having enough. And those fears are very real.
They are. But they can be paralyzing, too.
And they keep people stuck in this paycheck-to-paycheck cycle.
Yeah, that's that dependency on an employer.
Yeah.
And Kiyosaki contrasts this with the idea that financial education is not a 4-year degree. It's a lifelong journey.
It's a lifetime study.
Right. And it's something that a lot of people don't even realize they need to be studying. They just work and get paid
Yeah.
and never really understand the bigger picture.
And this leads us to another concept that he calls the rat race.
Oh, yeah, the rat race. It's like a hamster wheel almost.
It is. It's like you get up, you go to work, you pay bills, you do it all over again. And it's driven by these same fears, right? The fear of not having enough, the desire for more.
And that desire for more can be a trap too.
Yeah.
Because as you earn more, you often spend more. So you're just staying on that treadmill.
You are. And Kiyosaki points out that very few people actually figure out how to get off that treadmill.
Yeah. And it's something that he even noticed as a kid, right? He wondered why all the adults were rushing off to work, often looking unhappy, but they still kept doing it day after day. It made him question that traditional path.
Yeah, it really planted that seed of doubt. Like, is this all there is? And that questioning is so important because it's the first step toward, thinking about money differently.
Right. And it leads to that idea of exploring other paths, other ways of making money work for you.
Which brings us to another one of Robert and Mike's ventures, which is starting a comic book library.
Oh, I love this story. It's such a great example of putting those early lessons into action.
Yeah. Instead of just collecting and reading comics, they figured out how to turn their passion into an asset. They set up shop in Mike's basement and charged all the neighborhood kids a dime to come read.
A dime? That's like a business.
It was. They even hired Mike's sister to be the librarian, manage the collection, track the dimes.
So they were running a business even at that young age.
They were. And they learned about, managing inventory, like what happens when the comics get tattered.
You got to burn them.
They had to burn them.
Yeah.
They learned about finding reliable staff because their first attempt to expand, they couldn't find anyone, trustworthy enough to run the other location.
Yeah.
So it really gave them this hands-on experience with the practical challenges of building and running a business.
Yeah. And most importantly, it taught them about cash flow, right?
Cash flow, which is a huge concept that Kiyosaki emphasizes. And he uses these really simplified diagrams to illustrate the cash flow patterns of the poor, the middle class, and the rich.
Yeah, those diagrams are so helpful for visualizing how money moves.
They are. So for the poor, it's pretty straightforward. The money comes in and almost immediately it goes right back out.
Right. It's all going towards essential expenses. There's
Yeah.
nothing left over for anything else.
Exactly. Now, for the middle class, it's a bit more complex. Money comes in, and some of it does go to basic necessities, but a large chunk of it is going towards liabilities. Things like mortgage payments, car loans, credit card debt.
So they might be earning more, but they're also spending more.
They are. And again, very little is left over to actually build any assets.
And then there's the rich, right? Their cash flow pattern looks totally different.
Totally different. So their income comes in, and it primarily flows into their asset column, things like investments, businesses, things that generate more income.
So their money's actually working for them.
Yeah, it's making more money. And that income from their assets then covers their expenses, and whatever's left over, they reinvest back into acquiring even more assets.
Creating this amazing cycle of wealth.
Exactly. It's like a snowball effect. And Kiyosaki emphasizes that it's not just about earning a higher income.
Right. It's about what you do with that income, how you manage it.
Yeah. He calls it financial aptitude.
Financial aptitude, I like that. It's about knowing how to protect your money, keep it, and make it grow. So even if two people earn the same salary, their financial aptitude can determine whether they end up struggling or thriving financially.
Exactly. And this leads into his critique of what he calls the middle class trap.
Oh, yeah.
So he describes this typical scenario, right? A young, educated couple, they're starting out, they're being pretty frugal, and then their incomes start to rise.
They're climbing that corporate ladder.
They are. And they're like, okay, we're financially stable. We're going to buy our dream home.
Which, is often presented as the responsible thing
Yeah.
to do.
Right. Like, you're supposed to buy a house. You're supposed to, settle down. But Kiyosaki challenges this. He says, look, as their income increases, so do their expenses.
They're in a higher tax bracket.
Higher taxes. They're paying more for Social Security and Medicare. Then there's the house itself. There's the mortgage. There's property taxes. There's all the maintenance costs that come with owning a home. And then there's the temptation to furnish it and renovate it. So their liabilities just start piling up.
So even though they're earning more, they're not necessarily building wealth.
They're not. And he points out that the things that people in the middle class often consider assets, especially their house, can actually function more like liabilities if they're primarily pulling money out of their pocket.
Yeah, that's a mind shift.
It is. He also talks about home equity loans, which can feel like a solution when you've got, credit card debt or other consumer debt. But what they're really doing is just rolling that debt into a longer-term mortgage, which extends the repayment period.
And maybe even masks those underlying spending issues.
Yeah, you're not really addressing the root of the problem.
Right.
And he says that one of the biggest missed opportunities in this scenario is the lack of flexibility. When you have so much of your money tied up in a house, you might not have the funds to invest in other opportunities that could generate wealth.
So what is Kiyosaki's definition of an asset versus a liability?
He keeps it pretty simple. An asset puts money in your pocket, and a liability takes money out of your pocket.
That's a good way to remember it.
It is. It's all about cash flow. And he's constantly emphasizing that the wealthy focus on building income-generating assets.
Right. And he even talks about how when he wants to buy a bigger house, his first step is to buy assets that will generate enough cash flow to cover the costs of that house.
He doesn't just jump into a bigger mortgage.
No, he changes his income first.
He does. He focuses on the asset column.
And that, I think, is a key difference between the rich and the middle class.
Right. It is. The rich, their asset column is generating more income than their expenses, and they reinvest that surplus back into acquiring more assets, which creates this cycle of growth.
Whereas the middle class, their primary income is their salary. And as they earn more, they often spend more on liabilities.
Yeah, they end up further in debt.
Yeah, and he argues that this pattern is a big reason why we have so much debt in society today.
And why there's so much financial insecurity, especially with the decline of pensions and the uncertainty about Social Security.
It's a scary thought.
It is, and Kiyosaki really highlights the importance of financial education.
Yeah, knowing this stuff early on can make a huge difference.
It can, because when you don't understand these principles, you end up in a position where you feel like you have to play it safe. You only have your paycheck to rely on.
You're afraid to take risks.
You are.
That's
And that
right.
can prevent you from seeing and seizing opportunities that could lead to wealth.
Now, Kiyosaki does offer some examples of specific investment strategies he likes, but he's careful to say these are just examples.
Right. He's not saying, go do this blindly.
No. So what were some of those examples?
Well, he talks about small cap stocks. He likes those for their potential for fast growth.
Small cap stocks.
Yeah.
Those can be volatile though, right?
They can. They're riskier than large established companies. And his strategy with those is often to hold them for a shorter period of time, maybe a year or less.
Okay, so get in, get out.
Yeah. And in real estate, he talks about starting with smaller properties and then trading up to larger ones. This allows you to defer capital gains taxes. But again, he emphasizes that you need to understand the investment before jumping in.
Do your due diligence.
Exactly.
He also talks about corporations, which might seem like a topic that's only relevant to big businesses,
Right.
but he argues that they can be beneficial for anyone.
Yeah. He explains how the wealthy often use corporations as legal structures for tax advantages.
So they can deduct business expenses before paying taxes.
Yeah. And he gives some interesting examples, like potentially writing off travel, car expenses, even health club memberships, if they can be tied to business needs.
Wow.
But he's clear that this is all done legally, of course.
Of course, so you're paying less in taxes and keeping more of your money.
Exactly. And beyond the tax benefits, corporations and trusts can also offer protection from lawsuits and creditors. So the wealthy often control their assets through these entities, but they don't technically own them personally.
It's like a shield.
It is. And Kiyosaki also emphasizes the importance of certain qualities that aren't typically taught in school, but are crucial for financial success.
Like what?
Things like courage, a bit of boldness, and a willingness to take calculated risks. He says you need guts, basically.
Makes sense.
Yeah. He's not saying to be reckless, but he is saying that you need to be willing to step outside your comfort zone.
You can't just play it safe all the time.
You can't. And he cautions that without financial intelligence, you can really be left behind in this fast-paced world where information is power. He even tells this story about someone who got really upset while playing his Cashflow Game, which shows how resistant some people can be to examining their own financial habits.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to face those truths.
It is. And he makes the point that when you hold on to outdated ways of thinking, you're actually limiting your options, and that developing your financial intelligence can help you create your own luck because you're more likely to recognize and act on opportunities.
So how do you actually create your own luck? Can you give us an example?
Sure. He talks about a time when the Phoenix real estate market was in a downturn. This was back in the early 90s. And a lot of financial advisors were telling people to just save their money and wait it out.
Sounds pretty conservative.
It was. But Kiyosaki saw this as an opportunity, so he started buying these undervalued properties. And in one case, he bought a house for $60,000, put down only $2,000, and then sold it with a $58,000 promissory note at a 10% interest rate.
So he was essentially getting paid 10% interest on that $58,000.
Exactly. And he points out that it would take a long time to save that much money through a traditional savings account. Plus, the 10% interest rate was way higher than what you'd get from a bank. And if the buyer defaulted on the note, he could potentially repossess the house and resell it.
So he was making money passively without having to be a landlord.
He was. And it's a great example of how financial intelligence can be used to essentially create income.
It's like thinking outside the box.
It is. And he also talks about the importance of overcoming obstacles. One of the biggest ones he discusses is cynicism, that negativity that makes you focus on the worst case scenario.
Yeah, the Chicken Little mentality.
Exactly. And he says that while a bit of caution is good, too much cynicism can blind you to real opportunities.
Because you're so focused on what could go wrong.
Right. And he also addresses those common I don't wants. I don't want to fix toilets if you're talking about real estate, or I don't want to lose money if you're talking about the stock market. And he says these fears can actually prevent people from exploring potentially profitable avenues.
Yeah, it's like they're self-sabotaging.
They are. And to counter this, he tells the story of Colonel Sanders, who achieved incredible success with KFC, but only after facing tons of rejection.
So perseverance is key.
It is. You have to be willing to keep going, even when things get tough. He even talks about how to overcome laziness by suggesting you pay yourself first. So you save and invest before you pay anyone else, and then the pressure of your remaining bills motivates you to find ways to generate income.
It's like turning that pressure into a positive force.
It is. Now, Kiyosaki condenses a lot of his wisdom into what he calls the 10 steps to financial genius.
10 steps. That's a lot to cover.
It is. We don't have time to go through each one in detail, but some of the big themes are finding your why, making conscious choices about your money, surrounding yourself with the right people, mastering a financial formula, learning quickly, paying yourself first, choosing advisors wisely, managing your assets and people well, being generous, and using your assets to buy luxuries.
It's a roadmap to financial freedom.
It is. And throughout these steps, he stresses the importance of continuous learning and having a long-term perspective. He also talks a lot about developing financial literacy, which is basically understanding how to read numbers and make sense of financial statements.
Because if you don't understand the numbers, you can't really make informed decisions.
Exactly. And he doesn't shy away from talking about fear and failure.
Yeah, those are big ones.
They are. He acknowledges that everyone fears losing money, even the rich. But he says the difference is in how people manage that fear.
So the rich don't let fear paralyze them.
They don't. He introduces this idea that winning often means being okay with the possibility of losing.
So you can't be afraid to take risks.
You can't. And he sees failure as a learning opportunity.
Not the end of the world.
Exactly. He even quotes John D. Rockefeller, who famously said, "I always tried to turn every disaster into an opportunity."
That's a powerful mindset.
It is. And he emphasizes that building wealth isn't necessarily about being a genius, it's about having the right attitude.
Grit, patience, resilience.
All of that. Now, he goes on to talk about the 3 different types of income.
What are they?
He breaks it down into ordinary earned income, which is your salary or wages from a job, portfolio income, which comes from paper assets like stocks and bonds, and passive income, which is money you earn with minimal effort.
Passive income sounds pretty great.
It does. And he contrasts his poor dad's advice, which was to focus on getting a good job with a high salary, with his rich dad's emphasis on building passive and portfolio income.
So the rich dad was more focused on creating systems that generate wealth.
Exactly. And this leads him to discuss the Cashflow Game, which he created to teach people about these principles.
Yeah, I've heard of that game. It's supposed to be really good.
It is. He's got different versions. There's Cashflow 101, which teaches basic investing, Cashflow for Kids, and Cashflow 202, which focuses on more advanced investing techniques.
So you can learn by doing, but without risking real money.
Exactly. It's a safe way to experiment and make mistakes. And finally, Kiyosaki talks about the idea of finding your path, which he says is about more than just choosing a career.
It's about finding your purpose.
Yeah. He talks about how he initially followed a more traditional path, military and corporate world, but realized it wasn't fulfilling for him.
So he had to make a change?
He did. And he stresses the importance of aligning your work with your values and passions.
Not just chasing a paycheck.
Exactly. And he connects this to his 4 quadrants, which are employee, self-employed, business owner, and investor. And he says you can move between these quadrants as you work toward financial freedom.
So you're not stuck in one place.
You're not. And he uses this analogy of water carriers versus pipeline builders. Water carriers work hard to earn their income, while pipeline builders create systems that generate passive income.
So the pipeline builders are working smarter, not harder.
They are. They're thinking long term.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Rich Dad, Poor Dad, what are the key takeaways?
I think the biggest ones are the importance of financial education, understanding the difference between assets and liabilities, and the power of cash flow.
And don't forget about mindset.
Right. Shifting your mindset from working for money to having money work for you.
Overcoming fear and embracing failure.
Being a lifelong learner when it comes to your finances.
Because, as Kiyosaki says, money is just an idea. And the most valuable asset you can have is your financial intelligence.
Absolutely. So for all of you listening, here's something to think about. What kind of pipeline, no matter how small, could you start building today to move yourself toward a deeper understanding of finance and maybe even create some passive income streams in the future?
It's about taking that first step and building a solid foundation for your financial well-being.
One step at a time.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.